with USIBC. I lead our digital economy. I'm supported by a super strong team. Samir, if you want to come on the screen and say hello to everyone. We are excited to have you here today. For those of you who know me, we have been working on commercial space, opening up India's market and connecting it with the US commercial space enterprise for more than a decade. And so when something like the rules that came out recently, it really validates a lot of the work that we've been doing. Abhishek, I don't want to steer your thunder, but we know for the last few years, India has been opening up its market, creating a policy, some FDI regulations, and now some authorizations. There's been some institutional capacity building around commercial space behind that. And so we are here today to hear from Abhishek Malhotra from TMT Law Practice. He's a founding partner of that firm, and he's one of our space knowledge experts. And the overall agenda today is that Abhishek will share a few slides. We'll make those available to the team a little bit later after the call. And then we will open it up to some questions and comments. But before we begin, let me just share that today's call is being recorded. We'll make it available. I also want to make people aware that USIBC is working with Mission India in the coming weeks to organize a large commercial space event. We'll provide some additional details early next week as the lineup gets finalized, but it's looking like we have some senior officials from both in-country as well as coming from the United States, and we're really excited to have that conversation in Bangalore on May 24th. Stand by for additional details. And I will say that as part of that effort, we are pleased to have our association partners joining us as well. I see Bobby Prakash from SIA India, but we're also going to have Geospatial World, Chamber of Commerce, and hopefully ISPA and SSPI India join that event as well. So with that, Abhishek, over to you, sir, and I'll go on mute. You're still on mute, Abhishek.
Yeah, just
now you're off. Good.
Okay, so Jay, I think what we can do is, do you have the presentation that my colleague?
Yes, I do. I'll share that right now on the screen.
Okay.
And you just tell me where to begin, and here we go.
Sure.
I'm not on slide 1, but I will be. Over to you, sir.
So good evening, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are in different parts of the world. So very interesting times. We are today on the on the 8th of May. In the last 1 year, I would say, since the release of the Spacecom policy, what was in the works for about 3 years before that is finally getting into fruition. As I said, with the commencement of the Spacecom policy, there is a clear delineation, as perhaps most of us by now know, of the different responsibilities and duties to be discharged by the different instrumentalities that have been set up in this area: the Department of Space, ISRO, New Space India Limited, and to my mind, most importantly for the purposes of today's presentation, IN-SPACe. As again, perhaps as most of us perhaps will know, the announcement to set up an entity such as IN-SPACe had come about in May-June of 2020, and soon thereafter we had formally IN-SPACe set up as an entity. We have a very dynamic team that is at the helm of affairs of IN-SPACe, and we are seeing not just traction over the period of the last 2.5 to 3 years in this particular sector, in terms of the activity and in terms of excitement of something which for the longest time had always been centered around things are going to happen and ISRO is at the helm of affairs, and they will you can get the relevant authorization, etc., in certain periods of time. But today, the transparency the speed with which we are going about getting authorizations in place, and at least clarity in what exactly it is that a business in this particular industry can look out for is getting more and more sort of addressed and scoped in. So without getting into further sort of details about the introductory bit, which I've just gone through, heading straight into the presentation. So I briefly just mentioned to you what the role of InSpace has been under the policy. It's supposed to, it was mandated with promotion of the space activities within India, and it has discharged that function with a lot of aplomb, and we look forward to getting more and more activity in this space through the aegis of InSpace. But this, the new guidelines that have been released in relation to implementation of the policy and authorization for space activities are really providing a comprehensive regulatory framework which is designed to govern this. We had a draft version of this circulated in July, August of last year. We finally have a complete version which has been notified and made public as of last month. Jay, can we move on to the next slide, please? The question is, who needs authorization? Any entity that's engaged in the space activities to or from the Indian territory or within India's jurisdiction requires an authorization from InSpace. Who is it that can apply for such authorization? Primarily, if you're conducting this activity or these activities, you have to be an Indian entity. So the non-Indian entities that wish to conduct space activities in India will have to seek authorization through an Indian entity. So that's the reason why the FDI policy that was updated in February specified what are the various types of activities for which foreign direct investment can take place, and what kind of investment can take place and in what process. Just to very quickly summarize that, there are broadly three categories that are created under the FDI rules. One of those categories allows for 100% setting up of 100% investment in an Indian entity, and that's through the automatic route, which essentially means that you don't have to seek prior permission from the government department before you can start your activity in India. All that you need is to notify the authorized dealer, which is a local bank in India, which notifies that to the Reserve Bank of India that foreign investment is going to come in for this particular purpose. In relation to another second category, and I will shortly take you through what is, what activities are covered under what. But essentially, second category allows for up to 74% investment through the automatic route. And if you want to get the balance 26% also in terms of foreign investment, then you definitely need the permission from the government for that additional 24%. And then for that purpose, there is a portal that has been set up where you can submit your application and seek approval of the proposed investment. And a third category, which has more security concerns, etc., allows for 49% through the automatic route. And in the event that you need to take that 100%, then you have to go through the government route. So you have to seek government permission for that purpose. So which is why, coming back to this, the people who can apply for authorization are Indian entities. Just Jay, just go back to the earlier slide. I want to address this latter part of that. Authorized representatives or dealers of non-Indian entities can apply for certain categories of authorization, such as authorization for non-Indian geostationary and or non-geostationary satellite or constellations to provide capacity in India for communication services, dissemination of space-based Earth observation or remote sensing data, etc. This is pretty much consistent with whatever was already happening here in the prior to the Spacecom policy and the FDI, etc. But the ease of carrying out this business in India and related to India is exemplified in the event that you go through the Indian entity route. Can we move to the next slide, please? What are the activities that need authorization? It's an omnibus clause that any space activity, then there are inclusions launch, operation, guidance, re-entry of space object, etc. There's an Indian Spacecom policy which I referred to of 2023. These are outlined in section 5. Broad classification I provided in these slides. It's establishment and or operation of space objects, which includes space-based communication services, hosted payloads, establishment of space, operation of space objects, other than communication and remote sensing satellite systems. There's operation of space transportation systems, re-entry of space objects without recovery, establishment and or operation of ground systems. Next one, please. Dissemination of space-based Earth observation or remote sensing data, sale or purchase of transfer of space objects that are in orbit, and any other kinds of authorization that are announced by InSpace from time to time, because InSpace has that the obligation and the power, of course, to update this policy and all the requirements for the guidelines from time to time. Now, the authorization process itself. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes. The authorization process itself, we've just provided some sort of a flow chart just to demonstrate what are the steps that are part of that process. So you submit your application online via the platform that is available. There's a prescribed format in which you fill in all the details. There is then a preliminary assessment that is carried out by InSpace to just review your credentials and the capabilities. Based upon that preliminary review, you may receive an email seeking additional information. Once that information comes in, and there's an acknowledgement, and then there will be confirmation if the application is accepted for further processing. In the event that there's additional information required, they will keep sending you emails seeking that additional information till such time that there is clarity for them to be able to forward this application for further processing. Thereafter starts the process of the detailed scrutiny, where the assessment is based on a host of factors which I've listed here: safety, security, technical criteria, RF interference, liability issues, geopolitical factors, and other necessary considerations. And this is where it goes to the various ministries as well for confirmation. The Ministry of Home Affairs, in the event that there is something associated with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, it will go to them. DOT, wherever it's required. So these ministries then look at this application, and they may have their own set of questions for confirmation or clarifications. Once all of that is taken care of, that's when there is a provisional authorization that is issued pending any further approvals from relevant ministries. So ministries can come in at the stage of detailed scrutiny and or at the stage of the provisional authorization. And once the no objection is received from all the ministries, then a final authorization is issued. So your decision is made whether or not to grant that authorization. In the event that it is the criteria is not met, or that there are other issues that can be brought to the notice of the applicant by the various other ministries, or any of the objections are not cleared, then unfortunately the application can be rejected. Next slide, please. So the different types of activities that are covered here, we're just going to discuss some of those. The first, of course, is the space-based communication. So for the establishment or operations in order to provide communication services over India or outside Indian territory for an Indian entity, that will require authorization from InSpace. The non-Indian satellites or constellations also need authorization through an Indian entity in order to enable provisioning of the capacity to users for communication services in the Indian territory. And these satellites can either use Indian orbital resources or non-Indian orbital resources. In these NGP...
Abhishek, I'm going to jump in here in this, right, because this is actually really important. The use of non-Indian orbital resources wasn't always a sure thing, right? We've been talking about this for a number of years. This is actually a very important, granted it's tying to international best practices and general procedures worldwide, it wasn't always clear that this allowing of non-Indian orbital resources was going to happen. So I just wanted to stress that is an important policy win for the community. Back over to you.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jay, and this is something which right when the Spacecom policy in its draft form and the various iterations of that. And even when it finally did come out, there was still some sense of ambiguity as to whether or not non-Indian orbital resources can be used. And there was also some disturbing language about the requirement to transfer from non-orbital to Indian orbital resources. Thankfully, that has been clarified. But I must stress, nevertheless, and that's something which is perhaps reading between the lines, etc., is that in my view, someone who's using Indian orbital resources, that applicant may get preference in the processing of the application, possibly either in terms of timelines or in terms of the level of details that are required to be submitted in the process of authorization. So clearly, I agree with you, it's a big win, but it comes with a little bit of a caution that this is still, the preference is still going to be for the use of Indian orbital resources.
Thank you.
Under chapter 4 in these NGP sort of guidelines, there is a clear procedure to establish and or operate the satellite constellation. And I've provided what part of these guidelines these are available. What pertains to non-Indian orbital resources, the authorization for non-Indian GSOs, etc. So all of those are specifically detailed in parts of this, the different parts that I've mentioned, part 1, part 2, part 3 of chapter 4. And because this is a public document and people can possibly have access to it. And just generally to the audience here, because this is a rapid reaction sort of webinar, maybe a lot of you do not have access to this document. Maybe some of you can go after this to get access to it. And maybe there are questions that are available, that you have further to this presentation. So please feel free to reach out to Jay and or us so that we can resolve some of those doubts. I'm reasonably sure we'll be able to answer most of those questions, but because this is these are guidelines that have just been released, and I'm sure there will be learnings from practical applications of these guidelines. So I do see that the practical learnings will possibly, bring in a better scope and detailing of the working of these guidelines in times to come. But nevertheless, if people have questions at this juncture, happy to be able to address them, separately, because there's a lot to digest in this particular presentation. Can we move on? So establishment and or operation remote sensing and amateur satellite systems, we've just set out whatever is there in the NGP. Nothing unusual here. It's pretty much as per what is expected.
Just a quick question here. In my read of amateurs and from our experience, and often individuals are amateurs. They sort of get a taste of space. They then later on form a company. Does an individual need a license? Is an individual able to get authorization? How would a group of high school students who might want to get involved do this sort of thing, or would they be precluded because they're not defined as an Indian entity?
So again, this is something which perhaps we can seek further clarity on, Jay, because I do remember people. I do not know whether anyone from Dhruva Space is on this call, but I do remember sometimes in 2015-16 when we were just about starting this community in India of startups and other interested people wanting to get into this very exciting space. Sanjay from Dhruva Space was just mentioning to me that the time taken to seek such sort of authorizations or licenses to run an amateur sort of exercise is, by the time let's assume that you've applied for it in your first year, freshman year of college. By the time you've finished college in your senior year, you may just get that authorization, or you may not even get it. So clearly, I think this is also to address those instances. But I don't think that while approaching these guidelines, that sector of community has been really considered, which is why it's talking about an Indian entity. But to my mind, certainly that clarification can be sought from InSpace to allow for university students or people who are interested in this to be falling within the definition of Indian entity, and or to provide a specific definition to allow for individuals also to be able to do this. Next one. The framework and the guidelines of providing access of the available Indian orbital resources to Indian entities. So there is an entire framework that is provided. The Indian or non-Indian orbital resources, as Jay that we were pointing out, are permitted to be used. How much of a advantage does someone who's using Indian orbital resources really gets in the process of getting this authorization is, we'll figure that out from times to come. Please move to the next slide. There are three scenarios that are arising out of this. One, that the Indian entity makes use of unutilized, coordinated, or registered ITU filing under Indian administration, or unutilized ITU allotment or assignment to Indian administration. And or the Indian entity makes use of unutilized ITU filings which are in coordination stage under Indian administration, or the Indian entity applies for a fresh ITU filing under Indian administration through the WPC. For all these scenarios, applicant has to seek authorization from IN-SPACE for establishment and or operation of the space objects for the intended services. So in all these scenarios, IN-SPACE will have to be gone to seek the authorization. But it's just listing out whatever scenarios there are in order to make it clear that that these are the situations where authorization would be required, and the one-stop shop for that purpose is IN-SPACE. Next one, please. The Chapter 7 of the IN-SPACE guidelines sets out a detailed procedure, and part of this one is already seen in the DST guidelines that were issued in 2022. But in terms of space Earth observation or remote sensing data, I think this is just a reiteration of that. The high resolution space-based Earth observation or remote sensing data pertaining to Indian territory, and the primary data pertaining to Indian territory, which is greater than 30 centimeters GST from the Earth observation or remote sensing satellite. So this is consistent with what we've already seen with the DST guidelines, so there's nothing new there. Next one, please. I just set out what are the requirements in terms of the operation of space transportation systems, which is set out in Chapter 8. Establishing and operating of launch facilities by Indian entities which may be self-owned or leased, or mobile platforms which are located within or beyond the boundaries of India. And even includes guidelines for conducting suborbital and or orbital launches by Indian entities, whether from the Indian territory or outside of the borders of India. Next slide sort of basically sets out what is the establishment and or operation for ground systems, and all the categorizations and the kind of ground stations that are available are set out, and what are the requirements for each of those are also made sort of detailed in the guidelines themselves. Next one is interesting, which relates to the liability related aspects, because there was a lot of debate and 2 or 3 rounds of consultation that carried out to determine what should be the level of detailing in the authorization process from the point of view of liability. So it's mandatory third-party liability insurance that is required for launch operators. The IN-SPACE will assess what is the launch, based on the launch type and the potential risks, as to what the terms and conditions and the amount should be in terms of liability aspects. And of course, coverage will include damage from launch vehicles, payloads, government property, personnel. But the important part is that IN-SPACE retains that right to make that assessment and dictate the insurance terms and conditions and amounts. And perhaps at the beginning of opening up the sector to the private commercial space area, they want to be very careful about what exactly it is that is specifically the issue of liability, and that's the reason why they've arrogated that right to themselves. Of course, there needs to be adherence to international treaties, OST, liability convention. Launch operators have to include liability clauses in the contract. Space object must comply with international national regulations. Launch scenarios ensure liability is covered through insurance in space to provide review policy documents. From foreign territories, there has to be coordinate liability mechanism with the hosting nation and specific provision for third-party liability transfer to non-Indian entities when they are involved. Special provisions for the planned re-entry of space object may require special third-party liability insurance, and it will be evaluated on a case-to-case basis. Of course, as per UNCOPUS, there's space debris mitigation guidelines. You have to make that adherence, which is mandatory. If misconduct or gross negligence is established, liable parties must compensate for damages enforceable by InSpace and the GOI. Registration of space objects. There's a definition of space objects, which is any object launched or intended to be launched into an orbital or suborbital trajectory around the Earth or to a destination beyond the Earth orbit. Any constituent element of any object referred to in clauses 1 or 3, or any object that may be notified from time to time. So the important part to note is that this is an open-ended definition, which is subject to change and modification from time to time. And these norms, guidelines, procedures are applicable to those applying for registration of space object in the National Registry. And they were basically intended to facilitate the understanding of the registry and whatever there are in terms of reporting mechanisms or recording mechanisms which are need to be followed by the applicant. So, I would urge everyone to go through these guidelines and depending on what is of interest to each of the participants, and happy to field questions as and when those are made available to us. Thanks.
Great, and this is the fun part where we get to do questions and answers. My very first question, and members and participants, feel free to raise your hand, come on screen, type it in the chat box, whatever works. Abhishek, these just came out, if I'm not mistaken, on Thursday or Friday. One of the first things that have sort of popped up in Indian media is does InSpace actually have the legal justification to license these activities, right? Is that clear, or is there a need for a space law?
So my first up answer would be, Jay, and my my thoughts on this, that while we do have a policy and that policy seems to be reasonably detailed, however, at the end of the day, it's an expression of what India wants to have as a roadmap, and that's an expression from the executive. We really do need a more liability, clearly defined rights and liabilities of parties that are participating in this business, because there is a high risk activity at issue. There is high investment that is required. Very often, at least the Indian ecosystem of private sectors primarily is constituted of startups. So they are heavily dependent upon investors, and investors need clarity. So while some of that clarity has come about through the policy and now the guidelines, however, till such time that we have a law which is enforceable, to my mind, it is extremely important that we should have that law in place. Till such time that the law comes in place, I don't think that there is any real challenge to the authority of InSpace, because it's been set up under the policy and the direction of the executive, but there could be a potential challenge in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Jeremy Rose, and then Hamza, I'll hand it over to you to give us a little bit of the international perspective of how India and these new rules fit in globally. So, Jeremy, over to you, sir. You're on mute. And maybe if you introduce yourself, that would be great.
Come on, try and... There we go. Yes, hello, Jeremy Rose from Comsys in London. Thank you very much, Jay, and thanks, Abhishek. That's really, really helpful. So I'm saying this from a position of being in the UK, where we have laissez-faire, light touch regulation. This seems to me to be a regulator's dream. It's 100 pages of detail, and then requiring more detail, and then no specificity in very significant areas. Like, for example, you were just talking about liability. Oh, well, InSpace will decide what the liability levels are. Is this a way of stifling this very tendentious question, perhaps? Is this a way of stifling the relaxation of the regulation and say, oh yeah, boss, we're gonna provide all these rules and regulations, and it means that short of providing the color of the paint on the car of the toilet cleaner, you know, that everything else seems to be specified or not specified, and it just looks horrible.
So, Jeremy, my first up answer to that is we've moved from a situation where there was complete opacity in the manner in which any sorts of applications or authorizations were being handled by the entity which is ISRO, to a situation where there is verbosity, as you perhaps rightly said, in the 100 pages in the guidelines that are being prescribed by InSpace. From the point of view of, and I'll come to the second part where it says that InSpace continues to have the power and authority to modify this at any point in time. There are various aspects that are left open-ended. Wherever there is any clarity, it always follows with something saying that they have the right to modify this, etc. So I'll address that separately. But from a situation that existed for the last 20 plus years, where there was that opacity and there was essentially completely discretionary for an authorization to be granted, today there are some standards, some guidelines to at least pin. Let's assume that your application is made and your application does not pass muster and is rejected. At the end of the day, if you think that there was an unfair decision that was made, you can allude to some of these clauses of the guidelines and take that issue up either with the government itself or InSpace, as the case may be, or with the courts of law to say, look, these are the prescribed conditions. And yes, there is an omnibus clause which allows them to make this decision, but everything is tested on reasonableness. So if tomorrow the reason why your application is rejected is under the garb of security clearance, that you've not got security clearance from the Ministry of Home Affairs, even that is subject to judicial review. So as against a situation where it's a black hole, we don't know what are the bases for granting authorization. We have 100 pages of something that sets out what classifications there are, what are the activities that can be authorized, and what are the things that you need to put in your application to enable you to get that clearance. I would rather take the present situation than what is there earlier. I'm caveating that with the aspect that that over a period of time, InSpace already has a lot of applications that it's dealing with for the purpose of authorization. So we will know what is the criteria that is being applied in order to accept or reject such applications. And that's when, like any other sort of new industry or otherwise, that we will be able to see whether that is sustainable or not, and whether this promise that there is going to be transparency, this promise that there is going to be opening up of the sector for commercial participation is really true, or perhaps, as the skeptical part of your question reveals, this is just another way of stifling the so-called policy.
Thank you very much. Sounds like I should be buying shares in your law firm.
And I'll add just a little color to the commentary as well, Jeremy. We understand coming from certain nations that this seems a little bit overwhelming, but there's at least one unnamed company here that I know has had authorization requests sitting with the government for probably almost a decade through various iterations, and no movement, no understanding of why it moved or didn't move. We thought it would move, it didn't move, it had to be reapplied. And so in addition to what I thought was interesting, Abhishek and folks, was not only did they have a process, they gave some notional time frames to it as well. So I think InSpace, to their credit, they took a situation that it was very unclear of how to do things, and is trying to provide that clarity, including timelines, which will help industry think through some of the business decisions and investment and whatnot, rather than throwing a folder into the file into the mix and not knowing where it is or why it gets stopped. So, but certainly I appreciate your question.
I just wanted to add to what you just said, Jane. Thank you for sort of bringing that context in. Jeremy, I'm advising one entity right now, which is actually has applied for authorization. And during a, a discussion, which of course happened on video conference, one of the concerns that was raised by them was that because of the fact that there is an application pending for authorization and there's applications which are needed to be cleared in relation to foreign direct investment, etc., they currently have a contract with an Indian entity that is going to come to an end on 31st of December. And given whatever they need to put in place to make things operational so that they can operate even after that contract comes to an end, they need those authorizations to be confirmed on or before end of August, because they need a 3 to 4 month timeline to be making their own activities in India operational. And InSpace responded to say that, look, we have a hard stop for all contracts to be terminated on 31st December. We are not going to allow any extension thereafter. So therefore, the pressure is on us, InSpace, to approve all your applications or reject them, as the case may be, within the timeline that you've just proposed. So I think it's not just the document which is demonstrating the detailing that they've gone into, but also the intent which is demonstrated through these calls. Of course, we are 3 months away from August, and hopefully what they've said should come through. But I think that the intent is quite clear. They want to make this work.
And they're staffing up, right, Abhishek, to actually process
Absolutely.
these, because this
Absolutely.
is a new job. Okay,
Absolutely.
great.
Yes.
So Hamza, I'm going to hand over the microphone to you. Pranav, I'm going to ask you just to sit tight with your question for a moment, and then we have a question in the chat as well. Hamza Hamid is a true industry expert. We had the opportunity to meet in Geneva recently. It was nice to meet you finally in person. Has a lot of international and global experience. And if you could share a little bit, if we could put the India rules within context of what's happening elsewhere in Asia and the world, that would be really helpful. So over to you, Hamza. You're on mute.
Thanks a lot, Jay. It was very nice to meet you in person in Geneva just now. And I've continued, and I apologize for being late. I've continued on from Geneva, and I'm spending some time here at the Access Partnership Office in London at the moment. And I was pulled into a last-minute meeting, says a bit late. But like Jay said, we're a tech policy consulting firm, very active in the space and connectivity sector, and I lead our work on space and connectivity in Asia and the Pacific. And ever since the new, ever since this policy document came out, we've conducted several discussions with some of our clients with regard to the NGP, and these are clients that are looking at India as a market, and then are looking to grow into the Indian space ecosystem. And I think in this regard, I'd perhaps raise a list of 7 points that really illustrate and facilitate and really builds on what was being said earlier on in terms of showcasing India as a market that's in line with a lot of the international norms and best practices that exist, or at least signaling in that direction. So I think that the first one is the fact that the NGP puts forward all of these regulatory frameworks and standards in a very structured manner that are aligned with international standards and have constant references to treaties that are now norms and standard practices by regulators all over the world is very reassuring to the global community, and illustrates an adherence to global norms and a level of predictability, which, like Abhishek just said, was missing in the past and is quite critical in attracting international partners and investors. I think number two is, again, building on what Abhishek said, the authorization process that's been detailed for various space activities, including things like launch and operation of satellites, really ensures compliance with both international and national regulations, and also builds more towards India's own compliance with its obligations under international treaties such as the Outer Space Treaty. I think this robust process makes India an attractive destination for international collaboration by ensuring that activities meet a certain threshold of compliance. I think it's true that there are questions on mandate, on process, on procedure, but this is a big step forward and really paves the way for more regulatory action to build more structures around this sort of a document. I think one area that I was particularly pleased to see, and Access Partnership as a firm was particularly pleased to see in the NGP, was the focus on the management of space debris and the recognition of environmental concerns, and a view towards encouraging the exploration and use of space in a sustainable manner. I think space sustainability is the focus of every emerging space economy at the moment, and to see that being recognized in a high-level policy document such as these guidelines really emphasizes the focus by the Indian regulator on instruments such as the long-term sustainability guidelines of the UN, and indicates a move towards responsible space management. I think there's number 4. I think there's a lot of focus on capacity building and infrastructure development, and this outlines the growth in India's domestic space industry, as well as its capacity to build international collaborations and offer services. There's provisions for different types of entities, which again is very welcomed by the international space community, particularly operators looking to move into India now have a lot more clarity in terms of the expectations and the types of structures that they need to set up to be able to offer their services in India. Just as Abhishek was saying, leaps and bounds ahead of what the situation was in the past. I think 6 is this promotion for innovation and technology transfer. I think the NGP to a certain extent promotes an environment that ensures technology transfer and joint ventures, which again pushes for international collaboration. And while the final point, I think, while there is room for growth in this, there's a lot more transparency and openness on behalf of the regulator in terms of guiding the industry in how it's designed to set out, and then the types of regulatory structures that the regulator looks at in offering licenses and authorizations to companies to be able to operate. I think based on a lot of these regulatory innovations and the fact that there's a large degree of alignment with the UN treaties, as well as with the UN's guidelines on issues such as long-term sustainability and space debris mitigation, with that added focus on registration, liability, as well as also looking at ITU regulations. It's true that it's a long document, but at the same time, it's a very comprehensive document that can serve as the basis for additional regulatory efforts related specifically to particular industries in the future, where the space policy itself seeks to prioritize growth and development. I think additionally, the focus on compliance, both at an international and a local level, is very encouraging to the industry. So from the international markets perspective, this is certainly very encouraging, a very much step in the right direction, and making India a much more attractive market for a lot of these companies to move into, especially coupled with the relaxation of the FDI rules, even though I think, again, that's another area where additional developments do need to take place. All of these are positive developments and continue to increase the attractiveness of the Indian space market. So I'll stop there, but if anyone has any specific questions, me and my colleagues would be very happy to answer them either here or by email later on, and I'll drop my email in the chat. So thanks a lot, Jay, and really good chatting to all of you.
Great. Pranav, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful webinar. My question is to Abhishek on the issue of frequency coordination, which is in the space communication section. And I'm asking you that question because you've written about spectrum, right? In paragraph D of page number, sorry, I'm getting really specific here. In paragraph D of page number 27, page number 19, sorry, there is this long paragraph about how in space would ensure that frequency coordination between entities would take place, right? But the language is in such a way that it is left to InSpace to decide what is frequency coordination that is in good faith or bad faith. Whereas in the United States, we have seen how in the FCC, for example, when SpaceX was not being transparent enough about its frequency coordination, they had an appeal from other companies, established companies, and startups. So what are your perspectives, or what are your thoughts on the language here? Is it that we need another layer of mechanism where other players can appeal, whether if they feel that the frequency coordination is not in good faith and according to an industry? Thank you.
Yeah, Pranav, Abhishek had unfortunately to run. You dropped a note into the chat. So if you want to just email me that question, we'll make sure that you can get an answer. Hamza, is this something that you're able to answer? How would normally someone go about coordinating frequency? And do you think that the document sort of puts India in a position to align it in the same way that other countries do it?
Look, I think this is a good question. I think the fact that there is a certain degree of flexibility and openness on part of the regulator to determine some of these questions is not ideal. But again, like Abhishek said, the paragraph you're referencing in itself speaks to some of the core items that any regulator looks at in determining bad actors and a push towards frequency coordination, right? So frequencies should be coordinated generally on a non-protection, non-interference basis. Negotiations should be in good faith. There should be these frequency coordination agreements. I think regulators around the world are normally the type of regulator that's in charge of enforcing these types of conflicts is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. You are right that in the US, it's the remit of the FCC, but in other jurisdictions, we've seen civil aviation authorities do this. We've seen space agencies do this. And then we've even seen ministries of communication set up dedicated bureaus to do this. So it's not abnormal or out of the blue that an agency such as InSpace might have a certain amount of competency here. I do think you're right to say that we're yet to see cases of what these good faith negotiations pertain to, and as these cases start to come out, we'll learn more. But I do think this is again a step in the right direction. Yeah, that helps.
Great, thank you. I want to see if Alexandra, if you want to answer a question or two as well on Abhishek's behalf. There's a question from Arup. Arup, why don't you ask your question? I have two questions, and then we'll see if Hamza or somebody else from the group wants to take those questions up. So Arup, over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's not a question, but a comment. India has a wireless program coordination committee, which actually looks at all frequency requests and coordinates with ITU. So I do find this clause a bit confusing, because what is in good faith or not in good faith can be decided by this organization itself, the WPC of the Ministry of Telecommunications. So this factor should be looked at. Thank you.
Interesting. No, thank you for that. Great. So I have a question, and it's even the chat. You know, it's interesting. A lot of sectors are mentioned in space, almost all of them, but position, navigation, and timing is not. So I thought that was a curious, you know, in a very robust, full document. It's interesting that PNT was not mentioned at all. And then my second question is also, where does aviation broadband fit in? It wasn't clear to me if an airplane flying over India is in Indian airspace, but not landing or taking off. Do they need an authorization? Obviously, if the plane lands, I think it would be covered, or if it's an Indian airline. But if it's just an overfly, I thought that was an interesting, for me, lack of clarification. And if we were to ask in space about that, how would that work, aviation broadband? Hamza or anyone here, does anyone have any thoughts on those two questions of PNT and then aviation broadband? No? Okay.
I think happy to take the PNT question offline. I think
Yeah.
on aviation broadband, we do often see services related to aircraft excluded from strategies and policies like this, simply because a lot of these are managed by local civil aviation authorities. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of coordination in the background between the local civil aviation authority and in space with regard to overflight and then the reception of broadband services while on airplanes. I know this has been a sensitive and sticky point in India in the past, but yeah, I'm sure there's coordination on that in the background. Yeah.
I mean, India is one of the last countries to actually have aviation broadband, and I think it's been the regulation that's prevented it. So I actually do think it remains a gap and something that we'll raise with the government and try to figure it out. Pranav, another question for you, sir. Arup as well. If you...
Sorry, no, I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. Arup, did you have a question or comment, sir?
Yeah, I did have a comment, and that is India is considering the aircraft broadband, and I think that is the realm of the Department of Telecommunications.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Arup, my next question, I know you're going to be able to answer, so maybe you stay on screen. I thought it was really interesting that there's a requirement on the geospatial arena that you would need a license to download data and then share it to a certain degree. But now a lot of geospatial data is made available by foreign governments. I just want to use the recognized Landsat data as an example of many dozens of countries and programs that provide geospatial data free of charge, either through ground stations, easy to purchase, or increasingly via the internet. And obviously a foreign government is not going to license itself to India. A lot of this is handled in bilateral or multilateral kind of reciprocity agreements. And I thought it very curious that a lot of that information, just it wasn't clear to me in the authorizations how any of that would fit. If a company wanted to download Landsat and then do something with it, or an individual, how might that be covered? So Arup, I know you're a geospatial expert. I thought you might have some insights into that element of at least that segment.
Yeah, I don't think that's that part has really been addressed. The availability of free data and the use of that data for value-added services, though they have addressed the value-added services in one of the paragraphs. But this does remain an open question. That is, now do you have to license? You have to get a license to download the data? I mean, that would be disastrous in my opinion. But I think they have not mentioned it. And therefore, I think perhaps, keeping my fingers crossed, that they will not. They would not. In fact,
there was
Jeremy has
free data, by the way. There was reference to free data as well.
Yeah, I know. I know that. You have Landsat, of course, and then you have Copernicus, which comes out free. And in fact, Indian data itself has now been made free up to I think 5-meter resolution. They are setting it up. So I think those things have to be taken into consideration. Although, as Jeremy pointed out, that it's a very, very detailed document, but there are a lot of gaps. And particularly on the Earth observation side, I found too many of them.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, what is the point in clubbing remote sensing with amateur radio? I just don't understand that.
Yeah. Understood. I mean, so, all right, well, thank you. Any other questions or comments? And I can share a little bit about what we're planning on doing. And if Samir Gaduru is on the line, I'd like him to come and talk a little bit about our event coming up in a couple of weeks in Bangalore. It looks like we're going to be working on an activity around export controls in commercial space. And then we're working with Mission India, the US Embassy, to develop a day-long conversation around commercial space between the United States and India. Everyone here will receive an invite. I hope you all can come. We have some really nice conversations and some VIPs, fingers crossed, coming from the United States to join us. We'll share that full agenda. Next steps in USIBC's commercial space work is we will ask our members and the larger community if there's any comments or questions or clarifications. We have a great working relationship with InSpace. I think we could go to them and ask for some clarifications. Some of those issues were maybe raised today, but if there are others, do let us know. I do want to thank Hamza and Abhishek, our knowledge partners in our space arena, for joining us today. And if anyone here has any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be continuing our efforts to promote the US-India space arena. So with that, I want to thank everybody from joining, whether it was Silicon Valley or Singapore or elsewhere, and of course, everyone in between. Have a great morning and afternoon to you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you all.